Welcome back to What Should I Use? I'm Jake Bruton, and today we're going to talk roofing. And when we start this conversation about roofing, I want to read you something directly from the code right off the bat. I know it's super exciting, but I think it perfectly illustrates my point. We're going to go straight to IRC 2021 801.3, roof drainage. In areas where expansive soils or collapsible soils are known to exist, all dwellings shall have a controlled method of water disposal from roofs that will collect and discharge to the ground surface not less than 5 feet from foundation walls or to an approved drainage system. 5 feet. That is more than just a turn and a splash block. That is some sort of length of pipe. That is a buried system. That is something more than what I do on lots of my buildings. And I live in an expansive soil area, and I had no idea that was in the code. And guess what? 801.3 is very early on in that chapter. That's how big and dense and how much information are in 8 and 9 and covered in the roof section. And there is just an incredible amount in this section. And we're never going to cover it all in one video. We're never going to touch on everything. It is incredibly dense. And the reason it's incredibly dense is because when we look at the roof, we're asking for that assembly to carry a heavy load for our buildings. There is so much that that part of our building does to protect our structure, to protect our building, to be part of our envelope as a major player, that's why there's so much in the code. So rather than try to address everything in the code, we're going to pick one very specific part of the code that I think is really interesting, and we're going to talk about how we get to thinking about using that aspect of the code, and we're going to talk about a couple things that I think are pretty interesting, and I have a special guest for you today. Let's do it now. What should I use? A Build Original series hosted by me, Jake Bruton. Today's episode is sponsored by Sharkskin and Sheffield Metals. Before we jump into the code discussion, I want to have a quick conversation about choices made in roofing, particularly here in the United States. We can talk about here in Austin, Texas, or in Texas in general, but we can also talk about in general where I live or the places that I've got to visit. Metal roofing is a popular choice, but I think we can say that asphalt shingles are probably the most widely used, the most broadly accepted product. And I think that is kind of the same reason that gypsum wins out most of the time. It's easy to install, it's cost friendly, and it does do a decent job. However, I heard someone say recently that when we value engineer a building, we tend to engineer the value out of the building. And I think that we kind of look at asphalt shingles versus a metal roof as one of those opportunities to decrease the value of a building. Now, I'm not saying that there can't be opportunities of success with different types of roofing and that there's only one way to go. That's not where I'm headed with this. I happen to have asphalt shingles on my house. What I'm trying to say is that we have a tendency for some reason to look at metal roofing in the wrong way, and I think that we should be using the incandescent light bulb analogy and applying it here more often as builders guiding our clients. There is absolutely a cost argument that this is what should be going on your building, even in my market where we have hailstorms. The replacement cost, or the initial cost, I should say, of putting metal on is potentially 2 or 3x what an architectural shingle would be. However, the lifetime cost is at least 3x versus an asphalt roof in our market, and the durability upgrade here is absolutely worth it. So I want to start by saying that's why we're talking about a metal roof in the first place here. I want to push this as this is a starting point when we talk to our clients from a durability standpoint. And that durability conversation is going to run throughout this conversation today. And along those lines, before we get into code and our special guest, I also want to talk about the work that Fortified is doing. Fortified is a roofing and re-roofing standard that is a voluntary program that is partially funded by insurance organization that is completely designed to increase the durability of your building. There are testing standards that they've followed or testing metrics that they've designed that help a roof stay in place during major storm events, be it hurricanes or tornadoes or just high wind events, that are more likely to keep, let's call it the lid on your building. And if that lid is more likely to stay on your building, then the rest of the building from there down is more likely to stay there. So if you have an opportunity to hear Fred Malik or anybody from the Fortified system speak in person, I would take that opportunity. And I would say the Fortified standard has an incredible amount of stuff online. They are not a sponsor of the video. They have an incredible amount of stuff online that you can access their content and see their standards and learn about all of the methods that they have for keeping that roofing material and that membrane down and more secure to the roof, and hopefully costing you less money in the long run in the event of a storm. So, what are we going to talk about today when I said one section specifically of Chapter 8 that I find to be interesting? Well, we are going to talk about 806.5. If you want to pause now and go read 806.5, if you really are as nerdy as I am in this, I think this is a really interesting aspect. This is unvented and unvented enclosed rafter assemblies. So that is the mock-up that we have here today. And with that, we're going to bring on our special guest.
Here I am. I feel pretty special, Jake.
Our special guest today is Peter Yost. And the reason that I asked Peter, and if you don't know Peter, Peter is a co-host on the Unbuild It podcast, which you can also see on the Build Show Network. Peter is a longtime friend of mine now. He allows me to use the word friend. I have paid him enough money that I can say that now. But
Well,
Peter,
almost enough money.
Peter actually is the first person that turned me onto this section of the code. And like we had a long discussion about this, and I was like, oh, I want to talk about this because I thought this was very interesting. I should just ask Peter if he'll discuss this with me.
Sure.
So, thank you for crouching silently for 10 minutes back there.
Is this your tiny house? Because it's pretty cool.
So, I think it's an important distinction. We should start by kind of discussing 806.5 in the general context before we get to the part that I think is super interesting. So, 806.5 says unvented attics and unvented enclosed roof assemblies created by ceilings that are applied directly to the underside of the roof framing and structural roof sheeting applied directly to the top of the roof framing member rafters shall be permitted where the following conditions are met. So before we move on to following conditions,
Yep.
what's the difference between unvented attic and enclosed roof assembly?
It's a great question. So the unvented attic has an attic volume, and it is in conditioned space. This is a term that Joe Stieberg uses at buildingscience.com, which is that it's a cathedralized attic, which means it's not living space, but the air barrier and the insulation is at the rafter portion. And so that space is usually for mechanical systems, but the assembly of the rafter is unvented, and there is a space below it that is an attic space. Whereas the rafter assembly, that's a true cathedral, not cathedralized, because there, underneath the whole assembly is a living space rather than an attic.
Okay, and so that attic space, it's important to note, like, that might be tempered instead of like fully conditioned.
Exactly.
Like there might be mechanicals in there and we're just dumping a little bit of air into there, or we're leaking a little bit of HVAC into that space rather than like purposely making it the same condition as everywhere else, sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's sort of like, the conditions in basements aren't usually the same as living space, but it's tempered. Yeah. It's kind of the same way with what's sometimes called a semi-conditioned attic.
Okay.
But the key is that the thermal and air barrier are up at the rafters.
And so we're calling it inside, though.
We are calling it
But
inside the
inside.
building. Yep.
Okay. And
so does the code.
Yeah, and the code recognizes it as inside, and so that's That's an important distinction. And so the first of the following conditions are met is the unvented attic space is completely within the building thermal envelope,
Yep.
which is kind of what we just said.
Yep.
But the second one is interior class 1 vapor retarders are not installed on the ceiling side.
That's right. So you're not trying to control vapor movement from the room side, and therefore if you're going to put a vapor retarder there, it can't be class 1.
And so that's like okay, well, I just drywall then probably. Like,
Yeah, sure.
We're really not mitigating any flow there. It's really just like, okay, well then we're moving on to what's happening in the rafter or what's happening up here at that point.
Well, and it's also telling you that you're not really trying to get vapor control, particularly during the winter, at that plane. You're going to let that moisture get into that space.
And I think while we're not going to cover everything in 605.2 because it really is really long, those are kind of the most two important in the beginning of what this assembly looks like to start going, okay, here's where we're headed, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next most important part is the 5.2 because those were 5.1 still.
Sure.
5.2 says a whole list of things. Like, this is one of the largest subsections that I'm aware of anywhere in the code.
There's at least 10 subsections or separate items.
I think there's 10, yeah.
Yeah.
So to start with, all 10 apply slightly differently. I did note in my intro, I'm not sure if you were paying attention, you might have been asleep back there.
I'm Peter Yost, not Steve Basic.
Okay.
So.
We're assuming that this is climate zone 1 through 3.
Yep.
We're in Austin, Texas filming today. We're in climate zone 1 through 3. So the first one is in climate zones 1 through 3, air permeable insulation installed in the unvented attic space shall meet the following requirements. An approved vapor diffusion port.
Yep.
This is the lead. This is what we're here kind of to talk about. Shall be installed not more than 12 inches from the highest point of the roof, measured vertically from the highest point of the roof to the lowest edge of the port.
And the key here is that if you use an air impermeable insulation, everything changes. What you're trying to do is use a less expensive but still, perfectly adequate air permeable insulation, which is going to let the vapor get up into that cavity insulation.
Yeah. So that air permeable insulation, like we could resolve this by, closed cell spray foam.
You could.
It's not permeable, which is
and then you're in a different
common.
section of the code.
Yep.
Yeah.
Super common in this market even is that would be probably the most likely version that you would see here. You could use rooftop insulation, topside.
Right.
Rigid insulation probably.
Yep.
But if we're doing fluffy stuff in here, in the cavity,
Yep.
because we like cellulose or whatever it might be, and then we have our vapor permeable port up here.
So what's important here is that it's air permeable insulation, parentheses, also vapor permeable.
Yes.
So we're allowing that vapor to get up into an assembly because we've used a less expensive cavity insulation. So we still got to manage that vapor, and we have to do it in a different way.
And so that vapor that could potentially, and I say could because that's one of the things that we always miss. We talk as if because something's going to happen, it will happen. We say could. We've increased our risk by using that insulation. We've increased our risk by building an assembly that's this style. It doesn't mean that it is going to cause a problem. We're just planning for that problem to happen, right?
And we do know that before we use vapor diffusion ports in these milder climates, and we used air permeable insulation, the vapor got in there, it kind of ping-ponged around and moved a lot,
Yep.
but there was condensation at the underside of the structural sheeting.
Yep.
So we figured we got to do something to relieve that.
And that moisture is going to want to tend to migrate because it's going with the warmer air.
Yeah, the warmer, more moist air is less dense, and it tends to buoy or
Yep.
make a bubble right at the ridge.
So the top 12 inches of the sheathing has been removed. We have a 20 plus perm membrane up here, and that's a distinction in the code. I think it's in the first 2 or 3 here. But the next most important aspect here to this vapor port that the code does mention, I think it's in the top 4 or 5, is what about air sealing here?
Well, if you're going to let the vapor get up there, doesn't mean you don't have to absolutely without fail control air movement, because why bother with controlling the vapor if you don't have an air control layer? The other thing that's interesting is that where did they come up with like 10 inches off the ridge? We know that when we cut it back for standard roofs, to let
Airflow.
the airflow go up through there. It turns out that in the climate zones 1 through 3, you need more area to get that vapor out, because it's a square area thing, right? If it's more vapor permeable,
Yep.
it's per square area.
With that being not airtight, we would have a potential for a bigger draft.
Exactly,
That would
and more
cause
vapor.
more suction,
Yep.
more vapor, and then that just becomes a vacuum on the top side that draws in, and then we have every bit of moisture that's in the house wanting to be sucked into that assembly, because we now have a hole in the uppermost part of our entire building, and due to stack effect, we just have a straw that's just going to suck through the whole building.
We want to make sure we have absolute control over air, because then we have a tool to control the vapor.
Yeah, and I once had one of the more intelligent people that ever worked for me challenge me on how can something be vapor open but airtight, and I just said, well, let's look at drywall. Let's look at gypsum. It's vapor open, moisture can move through it. Concrete even,
And
right?
the key is air molecules are way bigger than water molecules. So that's the difference. You can make something airtight to stop the big molecules, nitrogen and oxygen, but water is relatively small and it gets through.
Yep. Now, in our normal conversation on what should I use, we talk about what does the code say, what does the industry council say. So we talked about IRC. Before you came on, I mentioned that we should really do our research and look into things like what Fortify says. And then I kind of always end with what does Jake say, or what does my experience tell me? And that's kind of where I surprised you with the mock-up when you got here today.
Yeah.
Because you were like, I thought we were talking about Vaporport.
Yes.
Why in the heck did you do this other thing here? And you were like, this doesn't have anything to do with Vaporport. I think you don't understand what a Vaporport is, Jake. And I was kind of like, well, we have two different things.
Yes.
So my conversation is this is one thing, and we need to build a more durable roof assembly is the other thing. And if I'm going to make the sales pitch that we're going to put a 50+ year potential roof on, that we need to be putting the best underlayment products that we can put underneath of it, and we need to be putting the best assembly underneath that we possibly can. So all the way through here, we've chosen what I would choose to do at my personal house or at a client's house that has a budget to support this is my A+ method. We happen to have Shark Skin is our sponsor. They happen to make the products that I would be choosing, so
Sure.
That's a great authentic alignment there. They have a self-adhered membrane over their dimple product. This is actually just like a dimple mat that we might use.
They've gone a foundation.
A foundation, or we can think of it as a rain screen for a roof. And we're doing a couple things here. I want your take on, like, you did walk in and go, this is surprising to me.
Yeah.
But now that we've gone through everything, walk me through your thought process on what you had here.
Well, first, I like that you said that these are kind of two separate things, and that in terms of the code, you've sort of taken care of your unvented rafter assembly. But now you're saying, okay, I've got control of the vapor coming up from the inside, but well, could I provide greater drying potential by letting air circulate between the sheathing here and the underlayment? And so what we have here is a low vapor class roofing underlayment. Then we have a dimple mat, and you were showing me, Jake, that look at this. We have spaces that air can flow from the soffit up to the top of the roof assembly, but we also have free drainage, right? So we're kind of covering all the ways that moisture moves in roofs. We've got vapor coming from the inside controlled by the vapor diffusion point. We've got airflow that helps to dry out because it's flowing right on it within the dimple mat. And then what we have is the bulk water being controlled because it's running right down. What I like about this especially is you've got best practice that's in your cladding, and you're honoring that with a system underneath of that really will sort of serve the same purposes as the robustness of your cladding.
And it should be noted, like if we had a zinc roofing here, we could flip this dimple mat the other direction, put the SA underneath of it, and then we have that, you know, there's no opportunity for water held in tension between the roofing and its underlayment. And then we would have exactly what we try to do with a rain screen cladding, just pitched, you know. And I would also say that this is something that I talked with Sharkskin about, and I said, I want to use this product and this product and this product. And their tech team said, we don't show that on our website, but that's fine. All those things work in exactly that way, and that's totally doable, and it doesn't void it shouldn't void any of your roofing manufacturer's warranties, and it absolutely does not void any of our warranties. It's just not something that we advertise, so you're good to go. They all work in that instance. We have all of that is engineered to work just fine. So there's a great point of call the manufacturer and say, here's what I want to do. You don't necessarily note it. Is this okay? And we got approval. And then I said, oh, by the way, this is just on a mock-up. And they were like, yeah, that's still fine. Like, we don't care that you're going to show that to people.
And what I love about this too is that we get questions all the time like, why do we put rain screens on walls but not roofs? Wouldn't roofs benefit from them as well? And the answer is they absolutely would, but we still have to provide support for the cladding or whoever's walking on this. And this system totally serves that purpose.
Yeah. So we have a system here. We have a code that is incredibly complicated, is incredibly dense, and there is a lot to it. But I think that it's really interesting that we just took one section, really, 805.6, and said, let's do a deep dive, and then let's apply, well, if I were going to do this at my own home, or if I lived in climate zone 1 to 3, what would it look like if I were doing it for myself? And here it is.
I would say too that the code has gotten more complex as it incorporates more building science. And the building science is always going to be climate tuned. So somebody might say, wait a minute, if this works so well for zones 1, 2, and 3, why can't I use it in 4, 5, or 6? And the answer is, with the change in the climate, everything changes with it. So a great follow-up this would be, you know, how is this different in colder climates?
Yep.
Did I lead you into what your next? What should I choose?
I think that might be a conversation to have in the future. Peter, thank you for joining me today.
It was a pleasure, Jake.
Until we meet again, have a good day.